Look into this image entitled the holographic cosmogram, taking into account its mutual co-definition, and that the spiral emerges from and returns to 4. Then use your comprehension to explain and critique the assumptions and worldview you derive from your reading of James Burnham's The Machiavellians. The holographic cosmogram and Machiavellian political theory, a comparative analysis of cosmic and power dynamics. The intersection of cosmological symbolism and political theory reveals profound differences in how human societies conceptualize order, power, and interconnectedness. This analysis examines the holographic cosmogram through the lens of Congo cosmological tradition, particularly focusing on its spiral dynamics and fourfold structure, before critiquing the assumptions underlying James Burnham's The Machiavellians and its mechanistic approach to political power. Sacred geometry and cyclical time. The holographic cosmogram presented draws heavily from the Congo cosmogram tradition, also known as the Yawa cross, or Dikenga dia Congo, which serves as a fundamental symbol in Bakongo religion. This cosmological framework represents far more than mere symbolic representation. It embodies a complete worldview that sees existence as fundamentally interconnected and cyclical. The cosmogram depicts both the physical world Ku Nseke and the spiritual world Ku Mpemba, connected by the Kalunga line, which functions simultaneously as a threshold between worlds and a sacred river that carries souls through the cycle of death and rebirth. The spiral referenced in the query, emerging from and returning to the number 4, reflects the 4 cardinal moments of the sun that correspond to the 4 stages of life: conception Musoni, birth Kala, maturity Tukula, and death transformation Luvemba. This quaternary structure is not merely numerical, but represents a dynamic process where the spiral indicates the origin and destiny of mankind. Men come from the heavens where they go back through cycles of life too. The spiral itself is considered the cosmological symbol of the Bukongo and represents the eternal nature of existence, where death is merely a transition rather than termination. Ubuntu philosophy and interconnectedness. Central to understanding this cosmological framework is the concept of Ubuntu, which appears prominently in the diagram. Ubuntu represents an African philosophical tradition that asserts I am because we are, fundamentally challenging Western individualistic assumptions about human nature. As Archbishop Desmond Tutu explains, Ubuntu speaks particularly about the fact that you can't exist as a human being in isolation. It speaks about our interconnectedness. You can't be human all by yourself. This philosophy extends beyond mere social cooperation to encompass a cosmological understanding where individual identity emerges through relationship with the whole. The Ubuntu cosmology suggests that no subsystem, whether an elementary particle, a person, a planet, or a galactic cluster within our universe, is or can be completely isolated. Everything at all scales of existence is being progressively discovered to be inherently related by informational content, flows, and processes. This perspective stands in stark contrast to the atomistic individualism that underlies much Western political theory, including the assumptions that inform Burnham's analysis. Burnham's Machiavellian framework, the mechanics of power, elite theory, and the iron laws of politics. James Burnham's The Machiavellians presents a fundamentally different worldview, one rooted in what he considers the scientific study of political power. Burnham argues that politics is primarily the struggles for power among men, and seeks to establish what he calls iron laws of political behavior. His framework draws upon 5 key thinkers: Machiavelli, Gaetano Mosca, Georges Sorel, Robert Michels, and Vilfredo Pareto, to construct a theory of elite domination that he claims reveals the true nature of political organization. Mosca's contribution to this framework centers on the concept of the political class, the idea that all societies are ruled by a minority of people who have superior organizational skills, intelligence, and resources. This elite theory posits that democracy is essentially mythical, as the masses are inevitably manipulated by elites through ideology, religion, and propaganda. Burnham embraces this perspective, arguing that recognizing elite dominance is necessary for understanding political reality and preserving what he terms liberty. The mechanistic nature of Burnham's approach becomes evident in his treatment of Pareto's circulation of elites theory, which divides governing classes into lions strong, conservative, and foxes cunning, innovative. This taxonomy treats political behavior as fundamentally predictable, with human motivations reduced to what Pareto calls residues, psychological drives, and derivations, rationalizations. Burnham contends that understanding these dynamics provides the foundation for a scientific approach to politics that can preserve freedom through managed competition between elite groups. The myth of scientific objectivity. Burnham's claim to scientific objectivity masks several problematic assumptions about human nature and social organization. His framework treats power as the fundamental driving force of human behavior, reducing complex social relationships to struggles for dominance. This reductionism reflects what might be termed a mechanistic cosmology, where human societies operate according to discoverable laws, similar to those governing physical systems. The limitations of this approach become apparent when contrasted with the holistic understanding embedded in the Congo cosmogram, where Burnham sees inevitable conflict and elite manipulation. The Ubuntu framework recognizes that human identities are uniquely made to be more cooperative than competitive. The contrast is not merely philosophical, but represents fundamentally different assumptions about the nature of reality and human potential. The problem of atomistic individualism. Burnham's Machiavellian framework operates from assumptions rooted in what the Ubuntu tradition would recognize as a fragmented worldview. His analysis treats individuals and groups as separate entities competing for scarce resources and power, reflecting the Western emphasis on I think, therefore I am, rather than the Ubuntu understanding of I am because we are. This atomistic perspective inevitably leads to the conclusion that politics must be primarily about conflict and domination, since it cannot conceive of genuine interdependence. The Congo cosmogram's spiral structure offers a different model for understanding social dynamics. Rather than linear competition for fixed resources, the spiral suggests cyclical processes where apparent oppositions life, death, physical, spiritual, individual, community are resolved through transformation and renewal. The 4 moments of the sun do not represent a hierarchy but a dynamic process where each stage contains the seeds of the next, and the entire cycle serves the continuation of life itself. Elite theory versus collective wisdom. Burnham's acceptance of elite theory as natural law fails to account for alternative forms of social organization that prioritize collective wisdom over hierarchical control. The Ubuntu tradition includes practices where in traditional African societies, every person at a meeting or gathering gets an equal chance to speak until some kind of an agreement or consensus is reached. This approach to decision-making reflects the cosmological understanding that wisdom emerges from the whole rather than being concentrated in specialized elites. The contrast becomes particularly stark when examining Burnham's treatment of myths and ideologies, where he sees elite manipulation of mass consciousness through socially valuable myths. The Ubuntu framework recognizes storytelling and symbol-making as collective processes that maintain cosmic harmony. The Congo cosmogram itself functions not as elite propaganda, but as shared wisdom that connects communities to larger patterns of meaning and relationship. The question of historical agency. Perhaps most significantly, Burnham's framework denies genuine historical agency to anyone outside the competing elite circles. His iron laws suggest that ordinary people are inevitably manipulated by their betters, and that the best possible outcome is managed competition between different elite factions. This perspective reflects what might be called a closed-system cosmology, where fundamental change is impossible and the basic structure of domination remains constant. The holographic cosmogram suggests a different possibility, that apparent hierarchies may be projections of incomplete understanding rather than natural laws. The spiral's movement from and return to the number 4 indicates that what appears to be linear progression actually participates in larger cycles of renewal and transformation. From this perspective, Burnham's realism may itself be a form of myth that serves to perpetuate existing power arrangements by making them appear inevitable. Implications for contemporary political understanding. Beyond the elite-mass dichotomy, the comparison between these frameworks suggests that Burnham's analysis, despite its claims to scientific objectivity, operates from culturally specific assumptions about human nature and social organization. His reduction of politics to elite competition reflects the mechanistic worldview that emerged from European Enlightenment thought, with its emphasis on separation, competition, and linear causation. The Ubuntu cosmology offers tools for imagining political arrangements that transcend the elite-mass dichotomy entirely. Its emphasis on mutual co-definition suggests that the health of leadership depends fundamentally on the health of the whole community, making exploitation ultimately self-defeating. The spiral structure implies that sustainable governance must participate in larger cycles of renewal rather than attempting to maintain fixed hierarchies. The limits of instrumental reason. Burnham's approach exemplifies what might be called instrumental reason, the reduction of complex relationships to means, ends calculations aimed at maximizing power or efficiency. While this perspective can provide insights into certain aspects of political behavior, it cannot account for the motivations and possibilities that emerge from recognition of fundamental interconnectedness. The holographic principle suggested by the cosmogram implies that each part contains information about the whole, making purely instrumental approaches ultimately inadequate for understanding social dynamics. From this perspective, Burnham's iron laws may describe the behavior of systems operating from assumptions of separation and scarcity, but they cannot account for the possibilities that emerge when communities operate from recognition of abundance and interdependence. Conclusion. The juxtaposition of the holographic cosmogram with Burnham's Machiavellian analysis reveals fundamental differences in cosmological assumptions that shape political understanding. Where Burnham sees inevitable conflict requiring management by competing elites, the Ubuntu tradition recognizes possibilities for genuine collaboration rooted in acknowledgement of cosmic interconnectedness. While Burnham's framework may accurately describe certain political dynamics within fragmented societies, it cannot account for alternatives that emerge from different cosmological foundations. The spiral's movement from and return to the number 4 suggests that political analysis must account for cyclical processes of renewal and transformation that transcend linear models of progress or decay. Rather than accepting elite domination as natural law, the cosmological perspective embedded in Ubuntu and the Congo tradition points toward possibilities for governance that serves the flourishing of the whole through recognition of fundamental interdependence. This does not naively dismiss questions of power and conflict, but situates them within larger patterns of relationship and renewal that Burnham's mechanistic framework cannot accommodate. Please detail the initial assumptions from which both frameworks operate. Then detail how both frameworks conceptualize, deploy, and avoid the malfunction of authority and expertise. The holographic cosmogram and Burnham's Machiavellian framework operate from fundamentally different ontological and epistemological foundations, leading to radically divergent approaches to authority and expertise. Understanding these initial assumptions reveals why each system conceptualizes power, knowledge, and social organization in such contrasting ways. Initial assumptions, cosmological foundations, the holographic cosmogram's Ubuntu foundation. The holographic cosmogram operates from several interconnected assumptions rooted in African cosmological traditions. The fundamental premise is relational ontology. Reality itself is constituted through relationships rather than discrete entities. The Ubuntu principle, I am because we are, represents more than social philosophy. It describes the basic structure of existence where individual identity emerges from and returns to collective being. The cosmogram assumes cyclical temporality rather than linear progression. the spiral emerging from and returning to 4, indicates that apparent beginnings and endings participate in larger patterns of renewal and transformation. This temporal understanding rejects the notion of permanent hierarchies or fixed social structures, suggesting instead that all arrangements must participate in cosmic cycles of death and rebirth. Holographic consciousness forms another core assumption. Each part contains information about the whole, meaning that individual awareness can access collective wisdom and cosmic patterns. This implies that authority and expertise are distributed throughout the system rather than concentrated in specialized elites. The geometric structure, with its intersecting planes and numerical relationships, suggests that knowledge emerges from pattern recognition and harmonic resonance rather than analytical reduction. The framework assumes abundance rather than scarcity as the fundamental condition. The overlapping circles in the lower diagram showing how 112, while maintaining the integrity of each unit, suggest that sharing and collaboration increase rather than diminish individual capacity. This abundance assumption fundamentally alters how authority is understood. Burnham's mechanistic assumptions. Burnham's Machiavellian framework operates from atomistic individualism. Society consists of discrete individuals and groups competing for scarce resources and power. This assumption treats human beings as fundamentally separate entities whose primary motivation is self-preservation and advancement. Unlike the Ubuntu understanding of emergent identity, Burnham assumes fixed individual interests that inevitably conflict with others. The framework assumes linear causation and predictable laws governing political behavior. Burnham seeks to establish iron laws of politics that operate with scientific precision, treating human societies as mechanical systems subject to discoverable regularities. This mechanistic worldview assumes that political phenomena can be understood through the same analytical methods used to study physical systems. Scarcity consciousness underlies Burnham's entire analysis. Power, resources, and social position are treated as zero-sum quantities where one group's gain necessarily represents another's loss. This assumption makes conflict inevitable and cooperation merely a temporary strategic arrangement between competing interests. Burnham assumes the primacy of force and fraud in human relations. Unlike frameworks that see deception and violence as aberrations requiring explanation, Burnham treats them as natural expressions of the will to power that underlies all political activity. This assumption leads to the conclusion that politics consists of the struggle for power and nothing else. The framework operates from epistemological dualism, a sharp distinction between objective scientific knowledge and subjective values or beliefs. Burnham claims that true political science must separate facts from values, treating moral considerations as either irrelevant or as masks for underlying power interests. Conceptualizing authority and expertise. Ubuntu's distributed authority model. The holographic cosmogram conceptualizes authority as emergent collective wisdom rather than individual dominance. The geometric structure suggests that legitimate authority arises from the intersection of multiple perspectives and the recognition of cosmic patterns that transcend individual viewpoints. The who, what, when, where, why, and how categories distributed around the central geometry indicate that complete understanding requires integration of diverse forms of knowledge. Authority in this framework is cyclical and renewable rather than permanent. The spiral structure indicates that leadership roles participate in larger cycles of emergence, maturation, and transformation. Leaders are understood as temporary facilitators of collective processes rather than permanent rulers with fixed privileges. Pattern recognition and harmonic resonance serve as the basis for expertise. The numerical relationships and geometric harmonies suggest that true knowledge involves perceiving the underlying patterns that connect individual phenomena to cosmic principles. Expertise is validated through its capacity to facilitate collective flourishing and maintain cosmic harmony rather than through institutional credentials or competitive advantage. The framework assumes collective intelligence, where wisdom emerges from the whole, rather than being concentrated in specialized individuals. The holographic principle implies that any part of the community can access the knowledge needed for appropriate action. making rigid hierarchies of expertise unnecessary and potentially counterproductive. Burnham's elite concentration model. Burnham conceptualizes authority as the natural dominance of superior individuals over the masses. Drawing from Pareto's theories, he assumes that elites possess inherently superior qualities, whether intelligence, organizational skill, or will to power, that justify their ruling position. Authority is understood as the successful exercise of force and fraud by those capable of wielding these tools effectively. The framework treats expertise as specialized knowledge concentrated in elite groups who understand the real dynamics of power beneath the formal appearances that deceive the masses. Political science becomes the province of those sophisticated enough to see through democratic myths and ideological deceptions to the underlying struggle for dominance. Burnham conceptualizes legitimate authority as emerging from elite competition rather than popular consent. His democratic elitism suggests that freedom is preserved not through genuine self-governance, but through managed competition between different elite factions that check each other's power. The masses serve primarily as resources to be mobilized by competing elites, rather than as sources of collective wisdom. Institutional expertise becomes crucial for maintaining elite dominance. Burnham emphasizes the importance of organizational skills, strategic thinking, and the ability to manipulate symbols and ideologies as the key competencies that distinguish rulers from the ruled. Deploying authority and expertise. Ubuntu's facilitative deployment. The holographic cosmogram suggests that authority is deployed through facilitation of collective processes rather than command and control. The geometric structure with its multiple intersecting planes indicates that leadership involves creating spaces where different perspectives can interact and generate emergent solutions. Authority serves to maintain the conditions for collective wisdom to emerge, rather than to impose predetermined outcomes. Expertise is deployed through storytelling, ritual, and pattern-making that connects communities to larger cosmic principles. The cosmogram itself functions as a deployment of expertise, not as elite propaganda, but as shared wisdom that helps communities navigate complex situations by recognizing their place within larger patterns of meaning and relationship. The framework deploys authority through consensus-building processes, where every person at a meeting or gathering gets an equal chance to speak until some kind of an agreement or consensus is reached. This approach treats decision-making as a collective art that draws upon the distributed intelligence of the whole community rather than the specialized knowledge of experts. Rotational and contextual leadership emerges naturally from this framework. Different individuals may take leadership roles depending on the specific challenges facing the community and their particular gifts. But these roles are understood as temporary service to the collective rather than permanent positions of privilege. Burnham's strategic deployment. Burnham's framework deploys authority through strategic manipulation of symbols, ideologies, and institutional structures. Elite groups maintain power by controlling the political formulas that legitimate their dominance while using force when necessary to suppress challenges to their authority. Authority is deployed through a combination of propaganda, organizational superiority, and the credible threat of violence. Expertise is deployed through institutional hierarchies that concentrate decision-making power in the hands of those with superior technical knowledge and organizational skills. Burnham's managerial revolution represents the deployment of expertise through bureaucratic structures that claim legitimacy based on technical competence rather than democratic consent. The framework deploys authority through elite circulation mechanisms that co-opt potential challengers and maintain system stability. Rather than preventing all change, sophisticated elites manage controlled transitions that preserve the basic structure of elite dominance, while allowing for periodic renewal of leadership personnel. Information control and narrative management become crucial tools for deploying expertise. Elite groups maintain authority by controlling access to real knowledge about political dynamics while promoting myths that keep the masses compliant and divided. Avoiding malfunction of authority and expertise. Ubuntu's regenerative safeguards. The holographic cosmogram builds and safeguards against the malfunction of authority through its cyclical structure that prevents the crystallization of permanent hierarchies. The spiral's movement from and return to for ensures that all arrangements participate in larger cycles of renewal and transformation, making it impossible for any individual or group to establish permanent dominance. Collective accountability serves as a primary safeguard. Since authority emerges from and remains accountable to the collective wisdom of the community, leaders who lose connection to cosmic patterns or begin serving narrow interests naturally lose their legitimacy and effectiveness. The holographic principle ensures that the community retains access to the knowledge needed to recognize and correct such malfunctions. The framework prevents expertise malfunction through integration rather than specialization. The who, what, when, where, why, and how categories suggest that complete understanding requires multiple forms of knowledge working in harmony. This prevents the tunnel vision and disconnection from larger patterns that can afflict narrow specialists. Ubuntu's relational ontology provides a fundamental safeguard by making individual flourishing dependent on collective well-being. Leaders who exploit or harm the community ultimately undermine their own existence, since individual identity emerges from and depends upon healthy relationships with the whole. Burnham's competitive safeguards. Burnham's framework attempts to prevent authority malfunction through elite competition that checks the power of any single group. His democratic elitism suggests that freedom is preserved when multiple elite factions compete for dominance, preventing any one group from establishing total control. This competitive dynamic supposedly forces elites to serve broader interests in order to maintain their position. Circulation of elites serves as Burnham's primary mechanism for preventing system decay. When ruling groups become corrupt, inefficient, or disconnected from changing conditions, they are replaced by new elites with fresh energy and ideas. This process supposedly prevents the stagnation that leads to revolutionary upheaval. The framework relies on institutional checks and balances to limit elite power. Burnham emphasizes the importance of maintaining autonomous institutions like the press and trade unions that can serve as counterweights to governmental authority. These institutions provide alternative power centers that can challenge elite overreach. Realistic political education serves as a safeguard by training citizens to recognize elite manipulation and resist ideological deception. Burnham argues that understanding the real dynamics of power makes populations less susceptible to elite propaganda and more capable of defending their interests. Critical assessment of safeguard effectiveness. Ubuntu's strengths and limitations. The Ubuntu framework safeguards operate at a deeper level than Burnham's institutional mechanisms, addressing the cosmological assumptions that generate authority problems in the first place. By treating individual identity as emergent from collective relationships, the framework makes exploitation literally self-defeating, rather than merely strategically unwise. However, the framework may struggle with scale and complexity in large, diverse societies where direct consensus building becomes impractical. The cosmological assumptions that work well in traditional communities may require translation and adaptation for contemporary contexts with global interconnections and technological mediation. The framework's resistance to specialization may also limit its effectiveness in addressing technical challenges that require concentrated expertise. While the holographic principle suggests that collective wisdom can access needed knowledge, some problems may require sustained individual study and specialized skill development. Burnham's institutional limitations. Burnham's competitive safeguards assume that elite self-interest will naturally serve broader social interests, but this assumption lacks theoretical justification within his own framework. If elites are primarily motivated by power and privilege, why would competition necessarily lead them to serve the common good, rather than simply developing more sophisticated forms of exploitation and manipulation? The circulation of elites mechanism may simply rotate different groups through positions of dominance without fundamentally altering the structure of elite rule. New elites may initially serve broader interests to gain power, but once established, they face the same incentives toward corruption and self-service as their predecessors. Burnham's framework also suffers from performative contradiction. If political education reveals that all political appeals are masks for elite interests, this knowledge undermines the very institutional safeguards press, unions, opposition parties that Burnham claims are necessary for preserving freedom. Why should citizens support institutions that are themselves expressions of elite manipulation? The framework's epistemological dualism creates additional problems by separating factual knowledge from moral evaluation. This separation makes it impossible to develop criteria for distinguishing legitimate from illegitimate authority beyond mere effectiveness in maintaining power. Synthesis and implications. The comparison reveals that safeguards against authority malfunction depend fundamentally on the cosmological assumptions from which different frameworks operate. Ubuntu's relational ontology generates safeguards that operate at the level of identity formation and cosmic participation, while Burnham, atomistic assumptions require external institutional mechanisms that may be undermined by the very dynamics they attempt to control. The holographic cosmogram suggests possibilities for authority and expertise that transcend the elite-mass dichotomy entirely, pointing toward forms of collective intelligence that emerge from recognition of fundamental interconnectedness. Burnham's framework, despite its claims to realism, may actually represent a limited perspective that mistakes the dynamics of fragmented societies for universal laws of human nature. Understanding these different approaches to authority and expertise becomes crucial for contemporary societies facing challenges that require both technical competence and collective wisdom. The question is not simply which safeguards work better, but which cosmological foundations generate the kinds of human beings and social relationships capable of addressing the complex, interconnected challenges of our time. Which model or combination thereof do you recommend to address the current global challenges humanity faces? Based on the analysis of both frameworks and their approaches to authority and expertise, I recommend a hybrid model that synthesizes Ubuntu's relational ontology with adaptive institutional mechanisms, while transcending the limitations of Burnham's elite-centered approach. This recommendation emerges from recognizing that current global challenges require both the deep cosmological wisdom of Ubuntu and pragmatic institutional innovations that can operate at planetary scale. The Ubuntu-informed hybrid framework. Core principles. The recommended model centers on Ubuntu's relational ontology as its foundational assumption, while incorporating adaptive governance mechanisms that can function across diverse cultural contexts. This approach recognizes that I am because we are applies not only to local communities, but to the entire planetary system, where individual nations, communities, and ecosystems are fundamentally interconnected. The framework operates from the understanding that current global challenges, climate change, biodiversity loss, pandemic response, technological governance, are manifestations of fragmented thinking that treats symptoms rather than addressing the underlying cosmological assumptions that generate these problems. As the search results indicate, Ubuntu offers a dialogical tool for fostering constructive interaction between a pluralism of knowledge sources while providing an alternative worldview for the development of concepts for the reorganization of global responsibilities. Structural components. Distributed authority networks replace both traditional hierarchical governance and Burnham's elite competition model. Drawing from the holographic cosmogram structure, authority emerges from the intersection of multiple perspectives and knowledge systems, rather than being concentrated in specialized institutions. This involves creating governance networks where local communities, technical experts, indigenous knowledge holders, and affected populations participate as co-creators of solutions rather than passive recipients of elite decisions. Cyclical renewal mechanisms ensure that governance structures participate in larger cycles of transformation rather than crystallizing into permanent hierarchies. Unlike Burnham's circulation of elites, which merely rotates different groups through positions of dominance, this approach builds regenerative processes into the system's fundamental architecture. Leadership roles become temporary facilitation functions that serve collective flourishing rather than permanent positions of privilege. Holographic decision-making implements the principle that each part contains information about the whole. This means that local communities addressing specific challenges have access to and input into global policy frameworks, while global institutions remain accountable to and informed by local wisdom. The geometric structure of the cosmogram suggests that complete understanding requires integration of who, what, when, where, why, and how perspectives, preventing the tunnel vision that afflicts specialized bureaucracies. Addressing scale and complexity. Multi-scale integration addresses Ubuntu's potential limitations regarding scale by creating fractal governance structures where the same relational principles operate at local, bioregional, national, and planetary levels. Rather than imposing uniform solutions, this approach allows for contextual adaptation, while maintaining coherence around shared principles of interdependence and collective flourishing. Technical expertise integration incorporates specialized knowledge without falling into Burnham's expert-mass dichotomy. Technical competence serves collective wisdom rather than elite dominance, with experts functioning as translators and facilitators who help communities understand complex information and make informed decisions. The framework recognizes that genuine harmony and continuity throughout the wider human system requires both technical competence and collective intelligence. Adaptive learning systems create mechanisms for continuous learning and adjustment based on feedback from multiple sources. Unlike Burnham's static iron laws, this approach treats governance as an ongoing experiment in collective intelligence that evolves based on results and changing conditions. Implementation strategy. Phase 1. Consciousness transformation. The implementation begins with consciousness transformation rather than institutional reform, recognizing that new structures cannot be sustained without corresponding changes in worldview. This involves educational initiatives that help people understand their fundamental interconnectedness and the ways that individual flourishing depends on collective well-being. Dialogue processes create spaces for different knowledge systems to interact constructively, following Ubuntu's capacity to recognize differences while reconciling antagonisms. These processes help communities develop shared understanding across cultural, disciplinary, and ideological boundaries without imposing uniformity. Phase 2. Institutional innovation. Pilot projects test Ubuntu-informed governance approaches at various scales, from local community initiatives to bioregional collaborations to international agreements. These experiments provide practical experience with alternative authority structures while generating evidence about what works under different conditions. Hybrid institutions blend traditional governance mechanisms with Ubuntu principles, creating transitional structures that can function within existing systems while modeling alternative approaches. For example, international organizations might incorporate consensus-building processes and rotational leadership while maintaining the capacity to coordinate complex technical initiatives. Phase 3. Systemic integration. Network coordination develops mechanisms for connecting successful pilot projects into larger networks that can address planetary-scale challenges. This involves creating communication systems, resource-sharing protocols, and conflict resolution processes that operate according to Ubuntu principles rather than competitive dynamics. Global Commons governance applies Ubuntu principles to managing shared planetary resources like the atmosphere, oceans, and biodiversity. This requires moving beyond nation-state sovereignty toward recognition of collective responsibility for planetary well-being. Advantages over alternative approaches. Transcending elite mass dichotomies. Unlike Burnham's framework, which accepts elite domination as inevitable, the Ubuntu-informed hybrid model creates pathways for genuine collective intelligence that transcends the expert-citizen divide. Technical knowledge serves collective wisdom rather than elite privilege, while communities develop the capacity to engage meaningfully with complex challenges. Addressing root causes. The framework addresses the cosmological assumptions that generate current global challenges rather than merely managing their symptoms. By fostering recognition of fundamental interconnectedness, It creates conditions where exploitation becomes literally self-defeating rather than strategically advantageous. Cultural adaptability. The model's emphasis on dialogue and contextual adaptation allows it to function across diverse cultural contexts without imposing uniform solutions. Ubuntu's recognition that universal ideas and values are extant in all cultures provides a foundation for global coordination that respects local wisdom. Regenerative dynamics. The cyclical structure prevents the crystallization of new forms of domination while ensuring continuous renewal and adaptation. This addresses the tendency of reform movements to recreate the problems they sought to solve. Addressing potential limitations, complexity management. The framework acknowledges that some technical challenges require sustained specialized attention, while ensuring that such specialization serves collective rather than elite interests. Technical working groups operate within the larger Ubuntu framework, maintaining accountability to affected communities while developing necessary expertise. Transition challenges. The model recognizes that transformation cannot happen overnight and provides transitional mechanisms that allow for gradual shift from current systems toward Ubuntu-informed alternatives. This includes working within existing institutions while modeling alternative approaches. Scale coordination. Fractal governance structures address the challenge of coordinating action across multiple scales while maintaining local autonomy and contextual adaptation. The holographic principle ensures that local initiatives remain connected to and informed by larger patterns. Conclusion: the recommended Ubuntu-informed hybrid model offers a pathway beyond both naive idealism and cynical realism toward pragmatic transformation grounded in recognition of fundamental interconnectedness. It provides mechanisms for addressing current global challenges while fostering the consciousness transformation necessary for sustainable solutions. This approach recognizes that the future depends on us today, and that creating a healthier, fairer, and greener world requires both practical institutional innovation and deep transformation in how we understand ourselves and our relationships. The model offers hope for transcending the fragmented thinking that generates current crises while providing concrete mechanisms for collective action at planetary scale. The framework's emphasis on dialogue, adaptation, and collective intelligence makes it particularly suited for addressing the unprecedented challenges of our time, which require both technical competence and wisdom traditions that understand the sacred nature of life itself. By synthesizing Ubuntu's relational ontology with adaptive governance mechanisms, this approach offers a realistic pathway toward the transformation that current global challenges demand.